All right, so get ready. Because today we're diving deep, really deep into the Death Note universe. But we're not just sticking to the manga this time. We're going all the way to the big screen, comparing how those Death Note movies adapted the story. And how they handle the moral side of things, too,
It's going to be fascinating to see how the movies tackle those big, really big questions about justice and power, right? And whether good intentions can really justify some pretty extreme actions.
We've got a lot to cover. We're talking like manga volumes 1, 3, 10, and 13. Plus the Wikipedia entries for Death Note 2, the last name L, the detective, and Misa, a man, too. Oh, and we've got this really thought-provoking Medium article titled Justice in Death Note. What is justice? No idea, but let's see.
Yeah, that's a good one. So basically our mission, right, is to figure out how those visually stunning movies handled the moral dilemmas that are woven into the very fabric of the Death Note manga. Do changes in, character and pacing make those themes hit differently?
For sure. Actually, before we even get to Light, the movies already make a big change. With his age, making him a university student instead of a high schooler like in the manga. So does that change how we view his choices, right? Making him seem more or less responsible for his actions.
It definitely adds another layer to consider. But before we get too deep into, character analysis, let's just break down the Death Note itself first. So this supernatural notebook is basically ground zero for all the moral conflict in this story. The manga, it kind of shrouds its origins in mystery, hinting that it came from the Shinigami realm, the world of death gods.
I was especially drawn to how the manga visually depicted the Death Note. It's an ordinary-looking black notebook, but it contains, unimaginable power, right? Inside, the rules are written like a binding contract, which just adds to the chilling effect.
Yeah, that contrast between the notebook's simplicity and the elaborate schemes it unleashes is striking. The creator, Tsugumi Oba, has said he was inspired by the ancient Japanese idea that spirits can inhabit words. And that definitely adds to the weight of actually writing a name in the Death Note, The illustrator, Takeshi Obata, even shared that his initial vision was for a more traditional, imposing grimoire, but the final, unassuming design makes its power feel even more kind of insidious.
Speaking of visuals, I loved how the manga depicted Light hiding his Death Note in a secret compartment under his desk drawer. To access it, you had to use a pen cartridge to release a tiny latch. Such a perfect visual representation of his double life.
Absolutely. It shows how he had to compartmentalize his actions, hiding his Kira persona from everyone. And the fact that the Death Note itself can communicate adds another layer of creepiness. It recognizes its owner, right? And can even talk to them.
It's like a dark reflection of our own relationship with technology. How it can become so intertwined with our lives and even influence our choices.
That's a great parallel. And speaking of influence, we can't forget the Death God who originally owned Light's Death Note, Shido. He actually travels to the human world to retrieve his notebook because he's not too happy with how Light is using it.
Yeah, Shido. Not the most cheerful Death God, is he?
Definitely not. And this brings us to Light Yagami, the one who finds himself wielding the Death Note's terrifying power. The manga describes him as the right and cold-hearted, an image that's perfectly captured in that panel where he stands with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Talk about foreshadowing.
Yeah, wow. His descent into darkness is one of the most fascinating aspects of the story. It starts with this idealistic goal of cleansing the world of evil, which, on the surface, sounds almost noble, but then, takes this dark turn.
That's where the manga's exploration of consequentialism comes in. This philosophy, which argues that the morality of an action is determined solely by its outcome, it aligns perfectly with Light's belief that the ends justify the means. The Medium article we have even draws a parallel to Socrates' ideas in Plato's Republic, where he grapples with the concept of an ideal society. It's as if Light is trying to build his own utopia, but through this incredibly twisted and violent method.
The movies definitely play with his psychology a bit differently. Both the movies and manga depict Light imagining the new world he wants to create. But the fact that he's older in the films adds a different dimension to those visuals.
Right. It makes you question if the movies are intentionally trying to make Light more sympathetic, even as he commits these horrific acts.
And then there's L, the brilliant, eccentric detective, who serves as the ultimate foil to Light's god complex. Now, the movies make some interesting choices with this character, too. In the manga, L's shrouded in mystery, his real name never revealed, but the movies give him a backstory, placing him in a government program for gifted orphans.
That added background makes me wonder if they're trying to humanize L more for the audience. Does it make him more relatable, or does it diminish the mystique that made him such a worthy adversary to Light in the manga?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
The Medium article highlights how L embodies deontology, which is essentially the opposite of consequentialism. For him, the means are just as important as the ends. He believes in upholding the law, even if it means a guilty person might go free. This clash of philosophies between L and Light is what makes their dynamic so captivating.
And the manga emphasizes their contrasting personalities through visuals, too. L's messy hair, dark circles under his eyes, and that signature slouching posture, which he claims, by the way, increases his deductive reasoning by 40%, all create a sense that he operates outside the norms of society. It's as if he's defying conventional notions of order, which is perfect for someone who's trying to catch a self-proclaimed god. We even see his Hapu heritage being of mixed ethnicity, adding to his unique character.
And then there are those amazing panels in the manga that show the elaborate camera surveillance networks that L sets up to track Kira. It's a brilliant visual metaphor for the themes of observation and control that dominate the story. Both Light and L are willing to go to extreme lengths in their pursuit of what they believe is justice.
And their methods raise some uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and the surveillance state. The manga doesn't shy away from those complexities, which is what makes it so thought-provoking.
This brings us to another key player, Misa Amane. Her devotion to Kira, which borders on obsession, really complicates things ethically. She's willing to sacrifice everything for Light, even going so far as to use her Shinigami eyes, which allow her to see people's lifespans and names, to help him achieve his goals.
The manga dives into her tragic backstory, revealing her deep desire for love and belonging, which makes her vulnerable to Light's manipulations.
The way she's visually depicted in the manga, with those stylish outfits, adds another layer to her character. It creates this intriguing contrast between innocence and danger.
And remember that powerful image of Misa with Rem, the Shinigami. It speaks volumes about her vulnerability and the dangerous forces at play in her life.
It's heart-wrenching to see how Light exploits her devotion, making you question the true nature of their relationship. But it's not just Misa. The supporting cast plays a crucial role in shaping the narrative and driving home those themes of justice and corruption.
Absolutely. Take Soichiro Yagami, Light's father, for example. He's a dedicated police officer who's forced to investigate his own son for potentially being Kira. Talk about a moral dilemma.
I loved that scene in the manga where he crashes into a Kira supporters festival wearing a motorcycle helmet to avoid being seen by Misa's Shinigami eyes. It highlights his desperation and the lengths he's willing to go to protect both the law and his family.
Exactly. It's those moments that show how the personal and the political are inextricably intertwined in the Death Note universe. And then, of course, there are Nier and Mello, L's successors, who take up the mantle of catching Kira in the later parts of the manga.
Yeah, especially Mello. He's so intense and driven.
He is. Nier, on the other hand, uses a more calculated approach, often arranging his toys to represent the people and scenarios involved in his investigations.
It's like it's a visual representation of his strategic mind. But I wonder how the movies handle these characters, given their shorter runtime. Condensing their roles could change how the themes of justice and corruption play out on screen.
That's a good point. We'll have to see how those adaptations affect the overall narrative. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the visual storytelling itself. The Death Note movies are known for their dramatic confrontations and elaborate set pieces. They definitely ramp up the spectacle compared to the manga.
But how does that cinematic flair affect the nuanced moral questions that the manga explores so well through internal monologues and strategic planning? In the manga, a lot of the conflict happens inside the characters' minds, where we see their rationalizations and their descent into darkness.
You're absolutely right. Take that panel in the manga with the elaborate camera surveillance network. It's such a powerful visual metaphor for the themes of observation and control.
And remember how the manga shows Light hiding his Death Note? That tiny compartment under his desk accessed with a pen cartridge? It perfectly captured the secrecy of his actions. Those visual details are what make the manga so compelling.
Exactly. But the movies have to condense everything, so some of that internal struggle might get lost in translation.
Which could change how the audience connects with the philosophical questions at the heart of Death Note. Remember the Medium article's comparison to Plato's Republic. Both stories grapple with the idea of an ideal society and the dangers of unchecked power. Light literally sees himself as a god shaping the world according to his will.
And the manga has that incredible scene where a crowd of Kira supporters is chanting his name, begging to be killed. It's a chilling visual representation of the dangers of blind faith
and the power of propaganda.
So how do the movies, with their more external, action-packed approach, handle these complex themes? That's something to keep in mind as we continue our deep dive. Indeed. It'll be fascinating to see how these different mediums approach those subtle but crucial aspects of the story. So picking up on that idea of visual storytelling, right? It's interesting to compare how the manga and movies handle Light's descent into darkness. In the manga, it's this slow, almost insidious process shown through his inner thoughts and strategic planning and visual cues, like increasingly like menacing shadows and intense eyes. But the movies have to condense things, so they might rely more on external cues like changes in his behavior or facial expression.
That makes me wonder how those differences affect the audience's perception of Light, right? Does the faster pacing of the movies with less focus on his internal struggles make him seem more sympathetic, or do his actions speak for themselves, regardless of how his inner turmoil is portrayed?
It's a question worth considering. After all, the manga really emphasizes the seductive nature of power, how it can gradually corrupt even someone with good intentions. We see that reflected in Light's gradual shift from wanting to punish criminals to eliminating anyone who stands in his way.
And that ties back to the whole idea of consequentialism, right? Where the ends justify the means, no matter how ruthless those means become. But the movies might not have the time to explore those nuances in the same way. They might have to show Light's transformation more directly through his actions rather than his internal monologue.
Exactly. And that could lead to different interpretations of his character. Some viewers might see him as a tragic figure, corrupted by the power he wielded, while others might see him as a villain from the start, his initial good intentions merely a facade. It all comes down to how those visual cues and narrative choices shape the audience's understanding.
Speaking of visual cues, I was thinking about how the manga uses symbolism and imagery, particularly in those scenes depicting the Shinigami realm. There's a sense of otherworldliness and decay that adds another layer of complexity to the story's moral landscape.
That's so true. Those visuals highlight the stark contrast between the human and Shinigami worlds, and they raise some fascinating questions about the nature of life, death, and fate. Do the Shinigami have free will, or are they bound by a different set of rules?
That's what I find so intriguing about them. They seem to operate outside of our traditional understanding of morality, often acting out of boredom or amusement. Ryuk, the Shinigami who dropped the Death Note into the human world, is a prime example. His motivations are never fully clear, which makes his presence both unsettling and fascinating.
Right. He's like a chaotic neutral force, observing the human drama unfold with a detached curiosity. And that detachment further underscores the ethical complexities of the Death Note itself. It's a tool with no inherent moral compass, its impact determined solely by the user's will.
And speaking of users, we haven't talked much about Misa's role in all this. The manga really highlights her tragic backstory, showing how her desire for love and belonging makes her especially vulnerable to Light's manipulation.
The scene where she makes the eye deal with Rem, sacrificing half of her remaining lifespan to gain the Shinigami eyes, is particularly poignant. It shows how far she's willing to go for Light, even at the cost of her own well-being. And the movies, with their condensed narrative, might not be able to delve into those emotional depths as effectively.
That's a good point. And it connects to a broader discussion of blind faith and the dangers of charismatic leaders. Light, with his intelligence and manipulative charm, effectively becomes a cult figure for some, inspiring both adoration and fear. The manga visually reinforces this with those chilling scenes of Kira supporters chanting his name. It's a reminder of how easily people can be swayed by powerful rhetoric, especially when it promises a seemingly utopian future.
And those themes resonate even more strongly today in our world of social media and influencer culture. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of critical thinking and the need to question those in positions of power.
Okay, so we've talked about the Death Note, the Shinigami, and some of the main characters like Light, L, and Misa. But there's one character we haven't touched on much yet, Light's father, Soichiro.
Soichiro. His unwavering sense of justice and love for his son creates such a heartbreaking conflict. In the manga, we see him wrestling with the possibility that Light might be Kira, torn between his duty to the law and his loyalty to his family. It's a moral dilemma with no easy answers.
The scene where he crashes into the Kira Supporters Festival, wearing a motorcycle helmet to avoid Misa's Shinigami eyes, really stayed with me. It shows just how far he's willing to go to uphold the law, even if it means putting himself at risk.
It's a powerful testament to his commitment to justice, but it also highlights the personal sacrifices often demanded by such a rigid moral code. And his death later in the story, which occurs differently in the movies, raises questions about the cost of pursuing justice and whether those ends always justify the means.
It's a reminder that even those with the best intentions can become caught in the crossfire of these larger moral battles, and it's something that I think the movies might struggle to capture with the same level of emotional depth.
That's a valid concern. The manga has the space to explore those internal struggles and moral complexities, whereas the movies might have to simplify things for the sake of pacing and runtime.
Which brings us back to the core question. How did these different mediums, the manga and the movies, ultimately shape our understanding of the themes and characters?
It's a fascinating question, and one that we'll continue to unpack as we delve further into this deep dive. But before we move on, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something we haven't discussed much yet. The ending. Without giving away any spoilers, how do you think the manga and the movies handle the conclusion of this morally complex story?
That's a great question, and it's something I've been pondering as we've been talking. I think both versions, the manga and the movies, try to deliver a sense of closure while also acknowledging the lingering moral ambiguities. But I also think the manga's ending, with its use of symbolism and visual metaphors, might be more effective in conveying the weight of those final choices and their lasting consequences.
I agree. The manga has the space to really draw out those final moments, allowing the reader to absorb the full impact of Light's journey and its ultimate resolution. It leaves you with a lingering sense of unease, a recognition that the questions raised by the story are far from settled.
Exactly. It's not a clean, happy ending. It's messy, complex, and leaves you with more questions than answers. And that's what makes it so powerful. It forces you to confront the uncomfortable reality that there are no easy solutions when it comes to justice, morality, and the choices we make.
Well said. It's a reminder that even in a fictional world where the lines between good and evil seem clearly drawn, the reality is far more nuanced and ambiguous. And it's those ambiguities that make Death Note such a compelling and enduring story, regardless of the medium through which it's told.
It's interesting, right, how both the manga and the movies kind of leave you with this unsettling feeling, even after the story is over. There's this sense that the moral dilemmas raised by the Death Note don't just disappear, when you close the book or walk out of the theater.
Absolutely. Death Note isn't just a story, right? It's like a mirror reflecting our own capacity for both good and evil. It makes you question your own judgments and whether you'd be so quick to condemn Light's actions, if you were in his shoes.
Especially when the story throws in characters like Teru Mikami, the prosecutor who becomes Kira's devout follower, like in the later parts of the manga. He takes Light's ideology to an even more extreme level, highlighting the dangers of blind faith and unwavering adherence to a single perspective.
Yeah, Mikami's unwavering belief in Kira's justice adds a whole other layer of complexity to the narrative. It makes you think about how charismatic figures can exploit people's vulnerabilities and manipulate them into committing acts they'd never consider otherwise.
And seeing his personal information exposed online in the manga, it really underscores his complete dedication to Kira's cause. He has nothing left to lose, which makes him both a dangerous and somewhat tragic figure.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of justice, even when driven by seemingly noble intentions, can lead to fanaticism and the erosion of individual morality.
Makes you realize that the power of the Death Note isn't just about killing people, it's about the potential to corrupt anyone who wields it.
Precisely. And that's what makes Death Note so relevant, even today. It forces us to confront, uncomfortable truths about human nature and the seductive allure of power.
And I think that's why both the manga and the movies resonate so strongly with audiences. They offer different perspectives on these timeless themes, but both ultimately challenge us to think critically about our own values and how we define justice.
And crucially, they both highlight the importance of challenging authority and questioning the status quo. Light, with his god complex, might seem like the ultimate villain, but the systems he challenges, corrupt officials, ineffective law enforcement, they have their own flaws.
Right, the story isn't, black and white. It forces you to consider all sides of the argument, even if you ultimately disagree with Light's methods.
Exactly, and that nuanced approach is what sets Death Note apart from other stories about heroes and villains. There's a moral grayness that permeates the entire narrative, making it much more thought-provoking.
I also think the visual storytelling in both mediums, while different, is incredibly effective in driving home those themes. In the manga, it's the stark imagery, the symbolism, those chilling close-ups on Light's eyes, as he writes in the Death Note.
And in the movies, it's the dramatic lighting, the intense soundtrack, those epic confrontations between Light and L. They create a different kind of atmosphere, but it's just as gripping.
It's interesting how Even the depiction of the Death Note itself differs between the manga and the movies. In the manga, it's this unassuming black notebook, which makes its power even more unsettling. But in the movies, it's often portrayed with a more elaborate design, almost like a mystical artifact.
Those subtle differences in visual representation can have a big impact on how the audience perceives the Death Note's power and significance. The manga emphasizes its ordinariness, suggesting that evil can lurk in the most mundane places. The movies, on the other hand, might be playing up the visual spectacle, adding to the sense of awe and dread surrounding the notebook.
And both approaches work. They just tap into different aspects of the story's core themes.
Exactly. It speaks to the adaptability of the source material and how different creative visions can bring fresh perspectives to the same story.
So where does this all leave us as viewers and readers, as deep divers into the Death Note universe?
I think it leaves us with a responsibility. A responsibility to engage with these complex questions, to challenge our own assumptions about justice and morality, and to recognize that the choices we make have consequences, even if they don't involve a supernatural notebook.
Death Note isn't just entertainment, it's a call to action, right? It's a reminder that we all have the potential for both good and evil within us, and it's up to each of us to decide which path we choose.
Well said. Death Note might be a work of fiction, but its themes and questions resonate deeply in the real world. It challenges us to be more thoughtful, more critical, and more aware of the forces that shape our individual and collective choices.
So, if you're looking for a story that will stay with you long after you've finished reading or watching it, a story that will challenge your assumptions and make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and morality,
then take a deep dive into the world of Death Note.
just be careful who you trust and keep a close eye on those notebooks, right? You never know when a Shinigami might be lurking nearby, waiting to see how you'll use that power. Until next time, deep divers.